The for each loop container has several built-in enumerators that you can use to iterate through some standard data structures in disk files. First one is the for each file enumerator. And as you can expect, it loops through each file in a specified directory using a file mask that you define. So you can process all zip files in a directory, all text files, or all CSV files, or all files. For each item enumerator loops through a set of items that you define manually within the container. There's a for each ADO enumerator, and this loops through each item in an ADO record set, such as a list of tables or rows within a table. There's a for each ADO.NET schema row set enumerator, which loops through each object in a database schema. There's a for each from variable enumerator that loops through the contents of a variable within the scope of the container, and that can be either a user or a system variable. There's a for each node list enumerator that loops through the nodes in an XML data contained within a file in a variable or entered directly within the container. In order to use this enumerator, you'll need to know XPath in order to define the nodes to iterate over. And then there's a for each SMO enumerator. And this loops through a set of SMO objects, which stands for SQL Management Objects. SMO is a programming API that's included with SQL Server. This lets you reach deep into the objects in an instance of SQL Server and manipulate them and access them and execute tasks based on them. Now you define the type of enumerator amongst all these different options using the enumerator property in the container's for each loop editor. The editor changes the configuration settings based on your selection, which makes it easy to define exactly how this container executes. What I'm going to do now is create a new integration services project, and I'll configure a for each loop that will iterate through the files in a directory and transfer the data from the files into a data reader destination object. Okay, so I have SQL Server Data Tools open, and I'm going to create a new project. File, New Project, Integration Services, Integration Services. I'll put it in C samples, and I will call this for each. And I'll go out and create the project. And there we have the package. I'm also going to rename the package. Come over to Solution Explorer, single click on that, and I'll name this for each as well, just to make it easier to find that particular package. Okay, so I'll jump right in, and I need to use a for each loop container. And so I'll drag it from the SSIS toolbox onto the surface. And I'll move it up a little bit to the left. And then I'll put a data flow task within that container. Okay, and there we go. Move it around a little bit. Okay, so the idea here is that I want this container to loop through and execute this data flow task for every file that it finds in the designated directory. Now, to make sure that this is actually contained within the container, I'm going to move this a little bit. And notice that the data flow task moves with the container itself. Sometimes it's hard to grab the container. So notice that this continues to move. If it didn't move with the container, then it's just floating out here in the control flow. So I want to make sure that it's part of the container. Now, the for each loop container is going to use a variable to store the name of each file that it reads from the source directory. So I'm going to double click on the container away from the data flow task in order to open up the for each loop editor. And I'll select the collection because this is where you can define what collection, the source of the collection, that this for each loop is going to iterate over. So this is where you can select the type of enumerator that you want to use for this particular container. Now I'm going to use the for each file enumerator. That just happens to be the default one. But there are all the other ones that I talked about that you can select. So there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different data structures, in-memory, physical resources, and so forth that you can iterate over. You just need to select the appropriate enumerator. All right, when you select that, that is going to change this enumerator configuration section because you need to define different kinds of information for each of the different enumerators. But in this case, it's files, so I'm going to use the Browse button in order to browse to the location where I have those files. And so these are in C, LearnNow, SSIS, Samples, and Containers, and specifically within the Source Data folder. And I'll click on OK, and that defines the location of that folder that I want to use, the location of the files that I'm going to iterate over as part of executing this container. All right, then I also want to provide a mask for the files. Now in this particular case, all of the files are .txt files. This mask would work. If we come over here to Windows Explorer, you can see that this is that location that I just set, and they're all text files. But if you want to be more specific, particularly if you have other file types in here that you don't want to iterate over, you can change that file mask and do star.txt. And now it's going to process only the .txt files within that folder. Okay, now I need to go to the variable mappings page here. This loop container is going to use a variable to store each qualifying file name for use by its contained tasks, specifically here, the data flow tasks. So this is a way to communicate between the container and the data flow task which file it's currently processing. All right, I'm going to select this first row and the drop-down button. I don't currently have any variables defined that I can access, so I need to define a new one. So I'll do that. Select that option. And that opens this Add Variable dialog box. All right, so the container is for each. That's why I want to leave it. I can define variables for other containers, which this control flow doesn't yet have, so my only option is for each. And then I want to define the variable name. I'm going to give it the incredibly clever name of text file, leaving out the E is in text. But you can use any valid variable name. Namespace is going to be user. It's not a system variable name. And the value type is going to be string. I can give it a default value, a starting value, but that's not necessary in this case because the container is going to populate the value each time it reads one of the files within that folder. Okay, click on OK, and there's that variable. So as you can see, I've defined a user variable called text file. So again, what's going to happen is that as the container iterates through each of the files in the folder, it's going to put the fully qualified variable name in this variable, and then the data flow task is going to have access to that value. All right, that's all I need to do for this for each loop container. So I'll click on OK, and now it's configured. All right, now I need to configure the data flow task. I have to do something with those files. So I'll double click on the task, and that opens up the data flow designer. So this is where I'm going to do the work of reading each file, the contents of each file, and processing it. And that's going to happen when the container passes that variable name, the file name that's contained within that variable that I just defined, in the text file variable. Okay, so I need a flat file source, so I'll come down here to Other Sources, double click on that, and that adds a flat file source, because they're all text files, those are flat files. And I'll double click on that to open up the flat file source editor. And then I need to select a connection manager. Don't have any yet, so I need to define that. And that opens this flat file connection manager editor. So I'm just going to name this flat file source. And then I'm going to use the Browse button. And I'll go up, and actually I need to go here to Learn Now, Samples and Containers, and the source data. Okay, so this is the folder containing those files that I want to read. Now here, unfortunately, this is a little bit weird. I have to fib a little bit to the dialog box. Even though the for each loop container will pass the name of each file name to the data flow task one by one as it reads each of those files, you have to select an actual file name in this step. Okay, so this isn't going to be hard-coded as such. This isn't going to be the only file that is selected. But I can't just select open because nothing happens here. I actually have to select a file. It doesn't matter which one that I select, but I have to select one. Okay, so I'm going to select blue in this case. All right, now I can click on open, and that defines that file name. If I come out over here, it has that blue.txt file. Now, the reason why it needed a file is that the designer needed to get its schema and load it into this flat file source. It needs to understand what data is going to be coming. Because remember, in a data flow, each source and then transformation has a specific set of fields, a schema of fields, including data types and file and field names and so forth, that it's going to pass in the data flow pipeline. And so at this point, by specifying blue.txt, I've now given this connection manager the information it needs in order to read that data and prepare it to put data into the pipeline. All right, the files all have column names in the first data row, so I want to make sure that that's checked. And as you can see, I'm not yet done configuring this connection manager because I still have this message down here. Now, that's a little bit misleading because I need to define columns, but when I go to the columns page here, it defines them and the message goes away. So just by selecting this, it's defined the columns, and now I'm good to go. But at this point too, I can also view the data just to make sure that it is getting all of the data in the fields correctly. Because sometimes there's different kinds of delimiters, there may be some sort of embedded quotes that aren't being parsed correctly in the file, and so you want to check and make sure that the data generally looks okay. And it's going to look at the first set of rows in order to make sure that everything is okay. All right, so we've defined the connection manager. Click on OK, and now we have that flat file source connection manager that is going to be the source of the data, or have the connection information for this flat file source. And at this point, I don't need to do anything with them, but I can look at the columns that are included. If I wanted to, I could deselect any of those columns because I didn't want to include them. I can also, as usual, rename any of the output columns. So these are the columns that are going to be put into the data flow pipeline. And in this case, I'm just going to use all of the default names. They're just fine for our purposes here. Okay, then another thing I can do too is come back over here to the connection manager, and if I wanted to preview the data one more time, this will display up to 200 rows, and I can make sure that everything is configured correctly. Okay, so this is the data that's actually going to be received into the flat file source, which is then going to be output into the data flow pipeline. All right, that all looks good. Click Close and click on OK. The red X goes away, so at least nominally it appears that our component is configured. At least it has all the information that it thinks it needs. Still could be some sort of runtime error, but it's at least initially configured okay. Okay, now remember I told you that I fibbed to the components a little bit. Now I need to undo the fib because I want to tell the flat file source to use the contents of that txt file variable as the actual name of the file to process. Okay, so I'm going to make sure that the flat file source here is selected down here in the connection managers pane. And then I'm going to go to the properties window. So it's already open there, or I can hit F4 in order to open it. And then I want to select the expressions property here. I'll click on the ellipsis button that opens up this property expressions editor. Select the first row. And in this case, what I'm going to use this variable for is to define the connection string. So this is the property of this connection manager that I'm going to get the value of from that variable that I defined. Okay, So this is how you specify that I want to dynamically change the value of a property of an object within integration services, change it dynamically at runtime based on some expression. Now need to specify the expression. Click on that ellipsis button there. And notice that I have access to a lot of different methods. I can create some very complex expressions. But in this case, I just want to read the value of a variable. Now, notice that there's a number of system variables available, so I can use those variables. So that has a lot of information about the environment and the current runtime state of the package. But in this case, I just want to use that variable that I've defined. So this is a user-defined variable. And I'll double-click on that. Actually, I'll drag it down here and add it to the expression. So notice what happened. It added the expression into the box here, put it in square brackets, and used a leading @ sign. So that's all I need in order to specify that the value of the expression is the value of that variable at runtime. Okay, I'll click on OK, and I've defined that. And so now each time this data flow task executes, it's going to use this flat file source connection manager and read the connection string that's going to be a fully qualified path and file name for the next file. And remember, that value is set for each file in that folder by the container within the control flow. So make sure that you understand the kind of the separation of concerns, what's going on at the control flow level within that container, as well as what's going on within the data flow. The data flow is only processing one file at a time, and then the container in the control flow causes the data flow to execute anew and have a new value for this variable each time it finds a new file in the folder. Okay, so I'll click on OK, and now that defined that expression. I can expand that, and there's the connection string, and it's going to use that variable value. Okay, so that configures our source. Now I need a destination. This is going to be a very simple kind of a data flow. So for this, I am going to use a data reader destination. So I'll double click on that and come down and move it over a little bit. Now, I'm just using this for the purposes of this sample. I need someplace for the data to go without actually doing anything with it. And the nice thing about this data reader destination is that it requires no configuration. So this is a handy technique as you develop a complex package and want to test it before you completely finish it. Okay, so select the data flow source, and I'll drag the blue arrow here to the data reader destination and drop it. And so now I have a precedence constraint from the flat file source to the data reader destination. Now there is one thing that I need to do with this destination. Even though I said that it doesn't require any configuration, there is one thing that you want to do. So I just double clicked on it. And what I want to do is come down here to read timeout and set this to the value of 0. The purpose for making this change is that it will make the component perform more efficiently in this particular package. If I don't change this, by default it's going to wait 30 seconds between processing the data from each file. Okay, so that would extend out the overall execution of the package by a couple minutes. Not a big deal, but it's just one of the side effects of using the data reader destination in the way that I'm doing within this package. Now, big caveat here, big caveat. In general, when you use a data reader destination to actually use the generated data reader object, where you're going to use that in-memory object within an application, you should not set the timeout property to 0 in a production environment. Again, but here I'm just using the destination object as a terminus for the data flow. As a terminus, if you don't set the timeout to 0, the package is going to pause for that 30 seconds before completing execution. So setting a 0 is merely for convenience, so the data immediately disappears. Okay, so be sure that you understand that. Okay, so I'll click on OK, and that's actually configured for use in the package. There's one other thing that I want to do. I want to be able to see the data that is flowing through the data flow pipeline. So I'm going to double click on this arrow between them. If I can actually select it, double click on it. And that opens this data flow path editor. I want to use what's called a data viewer, and I'm going to enable that viewer. I can select the displayed columns. This by default is going to show all of the columns in the data flow pipeline at this point as it's flowing between the source and the destination. So these are all the columns. I can select any that I don't want to include or remove all of them and then put back only a couple of them. But in this case, I want to display all of the columns that are coming into the pipeline from those text files. All right, click on OK, and notice that we have that little data viewer icon right there that indicates that there is a data viewer that's available there. All right, the idea here again is that we just want to be able to look into the data that's coming from each file each of the 4 times that this data flow task is going to execute when we execute the package. All right, at this point, I'm done defining the package. I can save it, although that'll happen automatically when I run it, and I'll go ahead and execute the package. So it's going to start up. We have the data flow selected, so it's going to display the data flow. Move this over a little bit. And you can see that the flat file source has succeeded. It's read all the data from the first file. And that first file has 93 rows. And because I defined the data viewer here, I get this window where I can examine all of the data within that file. Okay? So I can scroll down and can see all the data, scroll to the right. And so as you can see, this obviously has all of the products that have black as the color name. So again, nice thing here, I can view the data that's coming through here. Now, this can be kind of overwhelming. If the flat file source had 1 million rows, it's going to be a little bit tedious to go through all the rows within this data viewer. But you can look at the first few screens of it, see that generally it's processing things right, and then detach it, and then it'll just execute at full speed. Okay, I can also copy the data if I want to analyze it, say, in an Excel spreadsheet. I want to be able to sort it, find some sort of problem that's occurring. Okay, as you can see, we have 93 rows there. I'm going to click on this button here, and now you can see that the second file is being processed, and it has 26 rows. And I can scroll down and view all that. I can go to the third file, which has 99 rows, and I can go to the fourth file, which has 38 rows. And I'll click there, and that's the last file. It's gone to completion. The data viewer stays open, so I can continue to view the data from that last file. But as you can see, data flow tasks have executed successfully. Now, an important thing to understand is remember that as I viewed the data for each of those files, the flat file source, the icon here was green because it read all of the data from each file, one by one. So it got all the data, so that was done. While I was viewing it in the viewer here, the data reader destination was still processing. It saw that there was data coming, but the data viewer blocked it. And it had to do that so that I could look at multiple screens of the data. Okay? So that's kind of a quick and dirty how the data viewer works. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that window and take a look at the output window here. So this is in Visual Studio. So this is where you can see all of the things that happened as part of executing this task. And most notably, it has these notations where the processing of file, blah, 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 blue.txt has started. And it processes it, and blue.txt has ended. And then I can scroll down some more. I actually went past a couple of them. Everything else, so this is a file that has all the other colors from, I generated these files by exporting from the AdventureWorks database, one of the AdventureWorks databases. And so this had all of the other colors. And as you can see, red.txt got processed, had 39 rows, and red.txt was ended. So the output window is pretty nice for displaying everything that happened as part of this package. You can also come over to the progress window here and see a lot of the same kind of information. Some warnings and seeing the data coming in and so forth. So there's a lot of information there about the processing of this package. And then finally, I'll end execution by clicking on that link, or I can press Shift F5.